Today, we're going to talk about something that almost everyone feels, but very few understand: the housing market. Why? Because our young people can't afford to buy their first home, and that's not a coincidence. So, the question is obvious. What strategy can young people follow to buy a house today? Well, that depends on one thing: whether or not the housing market is in a speculative bubble, and whether that bubble is about to burst. But that's only the beginning, because behind the housing crisis, there's something much bigger going on. A war. Not a military war, although the US and China are already fighting one on many fronts. A monetary war. And in that war, those of us who try to protect our savings, who invest not to speculate, but to defend ourselves from the giant Ponzi scheme created by the global elites, need to understand what's really happening. Because make no mistake, they're coming for us. And yes, before we finish, I'll also share a small evil trick, a way to take advantage of a manipulation that the Swiss National Bank has been hiding in plain sight. So stay with me until the end, because by the time we finish, you'll understand that the real estate crisis isn't an accident. It's a political decision. Let's begin with the basics. The price of housing rises for two main reasons. 1. Scarcity of supply. There simply aren't enough homes being built. 2. Excess liquidity. The market is flooded with cheap money. So investors, and I'm talking about funds, corporations, and wealthy individuals, buy homes not to live in, but to rent out. That pushes prices higher, making it almost impossible for first-time buyers to purchase a home of their own. Let's take an example. In cities like Madrid or Barcelona, a two-bedroom apartment sells for around 350,000 euros to 400,000 euros. If we take a household of two working adults, earning roughly 35,000 euros each per year, that's 70,000 euros in total gross income. Now look at the ratio between the price of the home and the family's income. It's about 5 to 1. Back in 2006 to 2008, just before the housing bubble burst, that ratio was 4 to 1. So, we're above the levels of the last crisis. And that tells me one thing: the housing market is very likely in another bubble. But unlike in 2008, there's one major difference this time. We have an excess of liquidity, and central banks cutting interest rates. That cheap money fuels investment, and housing becomes the perfect asset to absorb it. Real estate investment funds are building thousands of homes to rent out, and big investors, and even middle-class savers, are buying property to protect themselves from inflation and government money printing. In Madrid, around 20% of homes are now bought by investors. In Barcelona, it's about 12 to 13%, mainly wealthy individuals rather than funds. The result? Prices rise, and young families are pushed into renting, which, ironically, costs even more than owning. So what's the solution? If we wanted to fix this housing problem, it would actually be quite simple. Governments could release public land, incentivize private construction, and remove bureaucratic barriers that slow down development. They could make housing affordable again by increasing supply and by reducing speculation. But they don't. They could act, but they won't. Because this situation suits them perfectly. The collapse of the housing market is not an accident. It's a political choice. Let's be honest. If housing becomes affordable, it benefits the middle class. It gives people independence, and independence makes them less controllable. But if housing stays expensive, people become dependent on the state. They need subsidies, rent controls, and public aid. That's exactly what politicians want. Dependency guarantees votes. It's not incompetence, it's design. Keeping the young trapped in renting and the middle class under pressure creates the illusion of crisis, which justifies more intervention. And every new intervention means more power for them. That's why I say, the real estate collapse is a political strategy disguised as an economic problem. They could solve it tomorrow, but instead, they use it to expand control. It's the same tactic we've seen with energy, money, and inflation. They create a problem, they manage the crisis, and they present themselves as the solution. It's pure politics, not economics. Now, let's add another layer. Central banks are lowering interest rates again. They're injecting liquidity into the system, hoping to stimulate growth. But what happens when liquidity floods the system? It doesn't go into salaries or productivity. It flows straight into assets, stocks, real estate, speculative investments. And once again, the rich get richer, while the working class gets crushed by higher prices. This is why I insist. The real estate collapse is not about economics. It's about political design. They inflate assets, control the narrative, and keep citizens too busy paying rent to question who's behind the curtain. Now, let me tell you something that almost nobody talks about. A small trick from the Swiss National Bank. While central banks pretend to be neutral, the Swiss National Bank has been buying massive amounts of U.S. equities, particularly in technology. They're one of the largest shareholders of Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. So while they tell citizens to save and be prudent, they themselves are investing aggressively in American markets to protect their purchasing power. In other words, they play the game, but they don't play by the rules. So when you see housing prices, rents, and interest rates going crazy, remember this. It's not a market failure. It's a political choice. You see, the housing market isn't just about real estate. It's a mirror of the entire financial system. And what that mirror reflects is not pretty. We live in a world where money has no value, where prices rise, but salaries don't, and where the only people who can buy assets are the ones who already own them. This is not capitalism. This is feudalism with Wi-Fi. Let's talk about fiat money. Central banks print, governments spend, and citizens lose purchasing power year after year. Every time they print a new euro, dollar, or yen, the value of your savings shrinks. And yet, they call it stimulus. But what they're really stimulating is inflation, speculation, and inequality. Because here's the truth. The destruction of fiat value is not a mistake. It's a policy. By destroying the value of money, they force you to spend, to borrow, and to depend. And dependency is the new form of control. The financial system has become a pyramid, a Ponzi scheme where the few at the top live off the liquidity created by everyone else's debt. The middle class, once the foundation of stability, is being systematically erased. They're turning society into two groups: those who own assets and those who rent their lives. The elites know this perfectly well. That's why they keep talking about inequality, but they never fix it. Because inequality is useful. It keeps people compliant, predictable, and dependent. That's why the housing collapse isn't a bug. It's a feature. Now think about this. If you can't afford a house, if you can't save in a currency that keeps its value, if your salary buys less every year, are you really free? They've made economic freedom a privilege, not a right. And every policy they announce, from green transitions to digital currencies, isn't about progress. It's about control. When money becomes digital and programmable, the system won't just tell you what you can buy. It will decide if you can buy. That's why I keep saying, the problem isn't the market. It's the architecture of power behind it. So what can we do? First, understand the system. Once you see how it works, you stop playing their game blindly. Second, protect your savings. Whether it's real assets, gold, Bitcoin, or productive investments, hold something that they can't print. And finally, stay independent. Because that's the one thing they fear most. This housing crisis, this inflation, this chaos. They're not random. They're designed. But remember, the same system that enslaves you with debt can also free you with knowledge. We can't change the rules overnight, but we can refuse to be pawns in their game. Because once you understand that the real estate collapse is political, you stop seeing yourself as a victim and start acting like an investor. If you enjoy this kind of macro analysis, clear, independent, and free from headlines, make sure to subscribe and like this video, because understanding the system is the first step to protecting yourself from it.